We have done an overview of Paul's letters and Paul himself, the great missionary and theologian. And we've already overviewed the book of Romans, or the letter to the Romans, the letters to the Corinthians, the letter to the Galatian churches, right? And the letter to the Ephesians. And we now come to another glorious letter of Paul, the letter to the Philippians. Let's go ahead and get started. So we can see here, notice we see in Acts 16 at the top of the screen. So setting sail from Troas, Luke says we, that is Luke and Paul, we made a direct voyage to Samothrake, and the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is a leading city in the district of Macedonia, in a Roman colony. We remained in this city some days. So you can see here on the left, pull my screen down just a tad bit, where Philippi is, just kind of in general here in the Aegean Sea, tucked away in at least in modern day Greece, that is. And then you can see here on the right, which this map includes Paul's journeys, where Philippi is right here. If you can see my arrow, and you can see kind of everything is slammed together here in the Aegean Sea in Asia Minor in Greece. And you can see as well, look how closely Philippi is right there to Thessalonica, not too far from Athens and Corinth. But Paul was able to do all of this traveling, right? And he had a fantastic impact in the Roman colony and leading district of Philippi. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and overview the letter proper. So first, Philippians 1:1, Paul and Timothy, this is not insignificant, servants of Christ to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are at Philippi, with the overseers and deacons, right? I am a Baptist, a committed Baptist, and this is one reason our polity, that is our church government, looks the way that it does, is because Paul here says, I'm writing to overseers, that is elders or pastors, and deacons. So he seems to outline a two-office church ministry, overseers and deacons. Now, so why is Paul writing? There's at least two reasons, right? He wants to give a ministry update. He says in Philippians 1, verses 12 through 13, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. So when we went over the letter of Ephesians, I didn't talk about this too much, but Paul was in prison in Ephesians as he's writing the letter to Ephesians, and one of the things he tells them is the same thing he says here to the Philippians. He tells them, don't lose heart that I'm in prison, because the gospel has gone forth, and I was always meant to share the gospel with Gentiles and suffer. But that's not the only reason, as there are in many of Paul's letters, like in you can think of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There's disunity in the church. He says, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche, Syntyche, that's a different word. But he entreats them to agree in the Lord, right? Paul's always dealing with division. You can see here Paul's general thrust in this letter is encouragement to unity and to joy. And he's writing this letter toward the end of his life. So just a few takeaways here. So one, Paul greatly encourages his church to unity. And he encourages the church to unity with Jesus as the preeminent example of humility. Right? As Christians, we're little Christs. We want to mirror Christ, his life, his service, his teaching. And Paul says, absolutely. This verse, this whole section is worthy to read out loud. So Paul says, if there's any encouragement, any comfort and love, any participation in the Spirit, look at what he says in verse 2. He says, complete my joy, that's a command, by being of the same mind, having the same love, being full accord in one another. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others. So I'm going to pause right there, those first 4 verses. Paul, as he says elsewhere, is teaching the church needs to be united. He says here in verse 2, being in full accord and of one mind. Okay, he wants unity within the church, unquestionably. And he says in verse 3, okay, maybe it was one way we do that. Don't be selfish or conceited, but be humble. And then he says in verse 4, also, don't look to just your own interests, but the interests of others. So this makes a lot of sense. We should have a basic understanding of this, right? Like if you want unity with people, sometimes you got to lay down your own interests and try to see the other side and to meet in the middle. But then he says in verse 5, he provides the best example you could ask for. And that example is Jesus. He says in verse 5, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, by being born in the likeness of man. And being found in human form, he, that is Jesus, humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even on a cross." All right, we'll pause right there. Paul says in verses 4 all the way down through 8, he tells the church to be humble, and then he says, be like Jesus, who was the ultimate humble person. How was he humble? He was God, and while remaining God, he became a man. So the Lord of glory took on human flesh, and in doing so was humble. And not only was he humble, he allowed himself to be killed. Think about that for a second. We have no room to be prideful when Jesus himself was humble. And we can see in verses 9 and 10 that Jesus' humility is rewarded. Verse 9, God has highly exalted Jesus, bestowed on him the name that is above every name. Every knee shall bow to him, and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord, to God's glory. So Paul says, be united and be humble like Jesus. You have no room to be prideful when your Lord is humble. And then lastly here, Paul gives just great encouragement to joy for the church. So one of his main emphases is he encourages the church to rejoice all the time. Be joyful, rejoice. Chapter 3, verse 1. My brothers, rejoice in the Lord. Chapter 4, verse 8. Brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, just, pure, lovely, if any of these things are praise, think about these things. Also, and Paul does this everywhere, it feels like, right? He encourages the church to beware of false teachers. Philippians 3, 2 through 3, look for the dogs, the evildoers, those who mutilate the flesh, probably the circumcision party, right? And then he says, why do you look out for them? Remember, we are the circumcision. And what Paul is saying there is that we are the true worshipers. We are the ones who have been made regenerate by God. We don't need to circumcise ourselves because we have a circumcised heart. Look out for those who are demanding circumcision. They're wrong. Read the book of Galatians, right? So, big overview again of Philippians. Paul calls the church to be united with Christ as our preeminent example of humility for the sake of unity. And then he encourages the church to rejoice, but also beware. The letter to the Philippians. And we'll now transition to the letter to the Colossians.